The security monitor in my penthouse office showed exactly what I expected to see at 3:47 p.m. on this rainy Thursday afternoon. A black Lincoln Navigator pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Berkshire estate, its tires crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel driveway that cost more than most people's annual salary. Through the tinted windows, I could make out the familiar silhouettes of three people I hadn't seen in person for 8 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My parents, Robert and Margaret Donovan, sat in the front seats, their backs rigid with the kind of tension that comes from swallowing pride. In the back, my older brother Marcus fidgeted with his phone, probably posting another one of his carefully curated Instagram stories about his successful entrepreneur lifestyle that was really just an elaborate house of cards built on other people's money. They had no idea that the 17-bedroom mansion they were about to enter belonged to me. No idea that the mysterious benefactor who had offered them this sanctuary during their financial crisis was the same daughter they had banished to sleep in their garage for 3 years. No idea that every step they took on the Italian marble floors would be monitored by cameras I controlled. Every conversation in the library would be recorded by systems I designed. Every meal they ate in the grand dining room would be prepared by staff who answered directly to me. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. But this wasn't fiction. This was 8 years of careful planning, strategic investments, and cold calculation finally coming to fruition. I watched as the Navigator stopped in front of the main entrance, where my estate manager, James Wellington, waited with an umbrella. James was a consummate professional, a man who had managed properties for tech moguls and oil barons before I hired him. He knew exactly who my guests were, but he would never let it show. To him, they were simply the Bennett family, the fake identity I had arranged for them to use during their stay. My father stepped out first, his once commanding presence diminished by the weight of recent failures. At 62, Robert Donovan looked every bit his age and then some. The stress of losing his construction company, the foreclosure on their family home, and the public humiliation of bankruptcy had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair completely gray. He wore a cheap suit that I recognized from Men's Warehouse, a far cry from the custom-tailored clothing he used to favor when his business was thriving. My mother emerged next, clutching a worn leather purse that I remembered from my childhood. Margaret Donovan had always been the picture of suburban elegance, spending her days volunteering at charity galas and managing household staff. Now, at 58, she looked lost and uncertain, her designer clothes replaced by department store knockoffs that didn't quite fit right. The woman who had once commanded respect at every PTA meeting and country club event now moved with the hesitant steps of someone who had forgotten how to navigate a world where she wasn't automatically given deference. But it was Marcus who drew my attention the most. My 28-year-old brother had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Even now, as he stepped out of the car wearing expensive sneakers and a designer jacket that I knew he couldn't afford, he carried himself with the same entitled swagger that had defined his entire life. He was live streaming on his phone, probably telling his followers some fabricated story about checking out a potential business opportunity at a luxury estate. What Marcus didn't know was that his successful lifestyle was funded entirely by credit cards that were maxed out, loans from friends who would never see their money back, and a cryptocurrency trading account that was bleeding money faster than he could hide it from his parents. I knew because I made it my business to know everything about my family's financial situation. Every debt, every bad investment, every desperate attempt to maintain their facade of success. James greeted them with the kind of polished courtesy that old money expects, but new money never quite manages to reciprocate. I couldn't hear the conversation from my office, but I could see the body language. My parents were grateful but trying not to show it, maintaining the illusion that they were still important people who deserved this kind of treatment. Marcus was already taking selfies with the mansion in the background, probably crafting some story about how he had connections in high places. The truth was, they had no connections left. The Berkshire estate was their last resort, offered to them through a shell company I controlled after every other option had been exhausted. They thought they were getting charity from a wealthy recluse who had heard about their situation through mutual acquaintances. They had no idea they were walking into a trap 8 years in the making. As I watched them disappear through the mahogany front doors, I allowed myself a moment to savor the satisfaction. These were the same people who had made me sleep on a cot in their garage because my presence in the main house was disruptive to the family dynamic. The same people who had given Marcus the master bedroom when he turned 18, complete with a private bathroom and walk-in closet, while I was relegated to sharing space with paint cans and Christmas decorations. The garage had been my world, from age 15 to 18. Not because we were poor. The Donovan Construction Company was thriving back then, and my parents lived in a 6-bedroom colonial in one of Connecticut's most exclusive neighborhoods. No, I slept in the garage, because I was the problem child, the one who asked too many questions and challenged too many assumptions. The one who had the audacity to point out that Marcus's straight C's in high school didn't exactly scream future business leader, or that my parents' constant indulgence of his every whim was creating a spoiled brat who would never learn to stand on his own. For 3 years, I had endured the Connecticut winters in that unheated space, piling on layers of clothing and sleeping bags while my breath formed clouds in the frigid air. I had done my homework by flashlight when the single bare bulb finally died, and my parents decided that replacing it wasn't a priority. I had learned to shower quickly in the main house during the brief windows when the family was out, because my presence there was considered an intrusion on their perfect domestic harmony. But the garage had given me something my parents never intended: privacy and motivation. While Marcus was upstairs playing video games and posting on social media, I was teaching myself computer programming, studying investment strategies, and building the foundation for everything I would later become. The cold and isolation that were meant to break me had instead forged me into something harder and more focused than they could have ever imagined. Now, as I sat in my climate-controlled office overlooking Central Park, I could see the beautiful symmetry of the situation. The family that had made me sleep in their garage was now living in my house, completely dependent on my generosity for their survival. They thought they were guests, but they were really prisoners in a jail cell that happened to have crystal, chandeliers, and heated floors. My phone buzzed with a text from James. The Bennett family has arrived and been shown to their quarters. They seem quite impressed with the accommodations. Shall I proceed with the standard orientation? I typed back, yes, but make sure to emphasize the house rules. No unauthorized access to the study or the east wing. All meals to be taken in the breakfast room, not the formal dining room. And James, make sure they understand that the garage is off limits. Tell them it contains sensitive equipment that could be dangerous if disturbed. The garage. Even now, the word made me smile. This mansion had a 6-car garage that was more luxurious than most people's entire homes. Climate-controlled, with polished concrete floors, custom storage systems, and enough space for a full workshop. It was the kind of garage that car enthusiasts dreamed about, the polar opposite of the cramped, dirty space I had called home for 3 years. But my parents would never set foot in it. Not if I had anything to say about it. I pulled up the surveillance feed from the main foyer, where James was giving them the tour. My parents looked around with the kind of wide-eyed amazement that told me they had never been in a house this grand despite all their pretensions to upper-class status. The Berkshire estate was an old money incarnate, built in 1923 by a railroad baron and meticulously maintained ever since. I had bought it 2 years ago from the baron's great-granddaughter, who needed quick cash to settle gambling debts. The price tag was $47 million, paid in cash. Marcus was still filming, but I could see him trying to be subtle about it. He would probably edit the footage later to make it look like he owned the place, or at least had the kind of connections that gave him access to it. His followers would eat it up, never knowing that their influencer idol was actually a broke narcissist living on borrowed money and borrowed time. The truth was, I had been orchestrating this moment for years. Every business deal that went bad for my father, every loan application that got rejected, every potential investor who mysteriously lost interest in Marcus's various schemes, I had played a role in all of it. Not directly, of course. I was far too smart to leave fingerprints. But when you control enough shell companies and have enough connections in the financial world, it's surprisingly easy to make life difficult for people who have wronged you. I hadn't destroyed them out of spite, though. I had simply removed the artificial supports that were propping up their undeserved success. My father's construction company had been surviving on reputation and legacy contracts for years, but the work was shoddy, and the management was incompetent. I had simply made sure that potential clients knew the truth about their track record. Marcus's cryptocurrency trading had been a disaster waiting to happen. I had just accelerated the inevitable by providing him with a few choice tips that led him to make even worse decisions than usual. The financial crisis that had brought them to my doorstep was the natural consequence of their own poor choices. I had just made sure they ran out of options before they could find a way to weasel out of the consequences. My assistant, Sarah, knocked on my office door and entered with my afternoon coffee. Sarah was 26, brilliant, and completely unaware of my personal history with the family now living in my house. To her, they were just another set of temporary guests, like the foreign dignitaries and business associates who occasionally stayed at the estate. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review," she said, setting the coffee on my desk. "And you have a video conference with the Tokyo office at 5. "Thank you, Sarah. Has there been any unusual activity at the house today?" She looked puzzled. "Activity? No, just the new guests arriving. James handled everything according to protocol. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" I smiled, shaking my head. "No, nothing specific. I just like to stay informed about what's happening on my property." After Sarah left, I turned back to the monitor. My family was now being shown to their rooms on the second floor. I had specifically chosen the east wing for them, the section of the house that was elegant but not ostentatious. The rooms were large and well-appointed, with antique furniture and original oil paintings, but they were also isolated from the rest of the house. More importantly, they were equipped with the most sophisticated surveillance equipment money could buy. Every word they spoke, every conversation they had, every private moment they thought was unobserved, it would all be recorded and analyzed. I wanted to understand how they really felt about their situation, how they talked about their past when they thought no one was listening. I wanted to know if they ever expressed any regret about how they had treated me, or if they still saw themselves as the victims of circumstances beyond their control. My mother was examining the bedroom she had been assigned, running her fingers over the silk wallpaper and testing the firmness of the mattress. She looked tired, older than her years, and for a moment I almost felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered the cold nights in the garage, the way she would look right through me when I tried to talk to her, the casual cruelty with which she had dismissed my achievements and amplified my failures. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Marcus was in the room next door, already unpacking his expensive luggage and setting up his ring light for more social media content. He was probably planning to spend the next few weeks posting about his exclusive retreat at a private estate, spinning some story about how he was there for business meetings or creative inspiration. His followers would never know that he was actually a broke failure hiding from creditors in his estranged sister's house. My father was in the study, examining the leather-bound books and antique globe that had come with the house. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the grandeur of his surroundings. The man who had once commanded construction sites and intimidated subcontractors now seemed lost and uncertain, like a child dressed up in his father's clothes. This was what I had waited 8 years to see. Not their destruction, but their humiliation. Not their death, but their complete dependence on the daughter they had discarded. They were alive, they were comfortable, and they were completely at my mercy. They just didn't know it yet. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would stay at the Berkshire estate for as long as they needed, believing they were the beneficiaries of a wealthy philanthropist's generosity. They would live in luxury, eat gourmet meals, and enjoy amenities that most people could only dream of. But every comfort would come with a price. Every kindness would be a reminder of their dependence, and every day would bring them closer to the moment when they would finally learn the truth about their mysterious benefactor. I had all the time in the world. My tech company, Meridian Dynamics, was valued at over $3 billion and practically ran itself. My investment portfolio was diversified across every major market, and my personal wealth was growing faster than I could spend it. I could afford to take as long as I needed to savor this moment, to let the anticipation build until the final revelation would have maximum impact. But first, I wanted to see how they would adapt to their new environment. Would they maintain their old patterns of behavior, or would their reduced circumstances force them to confront the truth about themselves? Would they finally acknowledge the way they had treated me, or would they continue to live in denial about their past? The surveillance feeds would tell me everything I needed to know. And when the time was right, when I had gathered enough evidence of their true character, I would make my move. The daughter they had banished to the garage was about to become the most important person in their lives. They just didn't know it yet. The first time my parents made me sleep in the garage, I was 15 years old and had just won the Connecticut State Science Fair with a prototype solar panel system that was 30% more efficient than anything on the market. I remember coming home that evening, my trophy and certificate in hand, expecting some kind of celebration or at least acknowledgement of what I had accomplished. Instead, I found my belongings packed in cardboard boxes, stacked, neatly beside the garage door. "Jessica," my mother said, using the tone she typically reserved for discussing unpleasant but necessary chores, "we need to talk." The family meeting took place in our formal living room, the one with the white furniture that no one was allowed to use except for special occasions. I sat on the edge of the pristine sofa, still wearing my science fair polo shirt, while my parents positioned themselves across from me like a tribunal. Marcus lounged in the leather recliner, eating from a bag of chips and occasionally glancing up from his phone to smirk at whatever was about to unfold. "Your brother needs more space to focus on his music," my father began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he used when he expected no arguments. "The recording equipment he's setting up requires acoustic isolation, and your room shares a wall with his." I looked at Marcus, who was nodding along while scrolling through TikTok. His music career consisted of making amateur rap videos that barely broke double-digit views on YouTube. The most sophisticated piece of equipment he owned was a USB microphone he'd bought on Amazon for $40. "I can use headphones when I study," I offered, though even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't matter. This decision had already been made. "It's not just about noise," my mother interjected. "Marcus is at a crucial point in his artistic development. He needs an environment where he can be creative without distractions." The irony was staggering. Marcus had never shown artistic talent in anything. He'd quit piano lessons after 2 months, abandoned guitar after 1 semester, and his idea of creative expression was reposting memes with his own captions. But somehow, this non-existent musical genius required my bedroom, my study space, and my connection to the main house. "The garage has been converted," my father continued, as if he were announcing a generous gift rather than a banishment. "There's a cot, some storage for your things, and we've run an extension cord so you'll have electricity for a lamp." A lamp. Singular. For the daughter who had just demonstrated that she could potentially revolutionize renewable energy technology. "Where will I shower?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can use the hall bathroom before school and after dinner," my mother replied. "We just ask that you be respectful of the family's schedule." The family's schedule. As if I weren't part of the family anymore. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. "Don't worry, Jess. It's just temporary until I get my demo tape finished." He said it with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced a single real consequence in his entire life. "Besides, you're always studying anyway. You probably won't even notice the difference." But I did notice the difference. The garage was cold, damp, and smelled perpetually of motor oil and old paint. The single window was too high to see out of and too small to provide adequate light. The concrete floor was hard and unforgiving, and no amount of blankets could completely ward off the chill that seemed to seep up from the foundation itself. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, though. It was the psychological isolation. I was still living in the same house as my family, but I might as well have been on another planet. Meals were served at specific times, and if I was late from school or had to stay for academic team practice, I simply went without eating. The main house was locked after 10 p.m., which meant that if I needed to use the bathroom in the night, I had to hold it until morning or risk waking everyone by knocking on the door. My parents framed it as a temporary arrangement, but days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Marcus's music career progressed exactly as I had predicted. Nowhere. The USB microphone gathered dust after the first few failed recording sessions, and his bedroom became just another space for him to play video games and scroll through social media. But the garage remained my domain. What my parents didn't realize was that the isolation gave me something I hadn't expected: complete freedom to pursue my own interests without their interference or judgment. While Marcus was upstairs wasting time and my parents were busy pretending their golden child was destined for greatness, I was learning skills that would actually matter. I started with small coding projects, teaching myself Python and JavaScript, using free online tutorials. The laptop I'd saved up for with my babysitting money became my window to a world where intelligence and creativity were actually valued. I built my first website at 16, a simple portfolio showcasing my science, fair projects, and academic achievements. Within a month, I had my first freelance client, a local business owner who needed help modernizing his company's online presence. The money wasn't much, just $300 for a basic website redesign, but it was mine. I had earned it with my skills, my time, and my effort. No one could take it away from me or claim credit for my success. My parents' reaction to this achievement was predictably dismissive. When I showed them the check, excited to prove that my technical skills had real-world value, my mother glanced at it briefly before returning to her magazine. "That's nice, dear," she said in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I had successfully tied my shoes. "Just make sure it doesn't interfere with your regular schoolwork." My father was even more direct. "Don't get distracted by these little side projects, Jessica. You need to focus on getting into a good college, not playing around with computers. Playing around with computers." That's how they saw the skill that would eventually make me a billionaire. Marcus, of course, had opinions about my new venture. "Web design is basically dead," he announced during one of the rare family dinners I was permitted to attend. "Everything's moving to social media now. You should learn how to make viral videos instead." This from someone whose most successful video had 16 views, 3 of which were probably from me checking to see if he had finally embarrassed himself enough for our parents to notice. But the dismissal and lack of support only motivated me further. Every night in that cold garage, wrapped in layers of blankets with my laptop balanced on my knees, I worked on projects that challenged me and expanded my capabilities. I learned database management, mobile app development, and eventually artificial intelligence programming. By my junior year, I was earning more from freelance work than most adults in our neighborhood made at their full-time jobs. I kept my growing success secret, not out of modesty but out of self-preservation, My parents had made it clear that they saw my technical abilities as a distraction from what they considered more important pursuits. If they knew how much money I was making, they would probably find a way to take credit for it, or, worse, demand that I contribute to Marcus's increasingly expensive lifestyle, because Marcus's needs kept growing. The bedroom that had supposedly been essential for his music career became insufficient when he decided he wanted to try his hand at streaming video games. Suddenly, he needed a second computer, professional lighting equipment, and a high-speed internet upgrade that cost more per month than most people spent on groceries. My parents provided it all without question. When Marcus announced that he was dropping out of college after one semester to focus on building his personal brand, they supported his decision and continued to fund his lifestyle. When he crashed his car while driving under the influence and needed money for legal fees, they refinanced their house to pay for the best attorney in the state. Meanwhile, I was still sleeping in the garage, still showering on a restricted schedule, still eating dinner alone more often than not because my academic commitments conflicted with the family's preferred meal times. The contrast became even more stark during my senior year, when I was accepted to MIT with a full scholarship for my work in renewable energy technology. My parents attended the awards ceremony where I received recognition for achieving the highest SAT scores in our school's history, but they spent the entire evening talking to other parents about Marcus's latest entrepreneurial venture, a short-lived attempt to sell custom phone cases that lasted exactly 3 weeks before he lost interest. On graduation day, while other families celebrated their children's achievements with parties and special dinners, my parents took Marcus to an expensive restaurant to console him after another failed business idea. I ate leftover pizza in the garage and planned my escape to Boston. That night, as I packed my belongings for college, I made a promise to myself. Someday, I would have enough power and wealth to make them understand what they had done. Not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the simple demonstration of consequences. They had treated me like I was worth less than their golden child, like my achievements were insignificant compared to his potential. I would prove them wrong in the most devastating way possible, by succeeding beyond their wildest dreams and then making them completely dependent on the daughter they had discarded. The plan began that night in the garage, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the smell of motor oil. It would take years to execute, but I had learned patience during those long, cold nights. I had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate satisfaction, but the slow, methodical construction of perfect justice. As I finally drifted, off to sleep on that uncomfortable cot for the last time, I smiled at the thought of what was coming. They had no idea what they had created by banishing me to that garage. They thought they were punishing me, but they had actually been forging the weapon that would eventually destroy their comfortable illusions about themselves. The daughter they had overlooked was about to become impossible to ignore. MIT was everything. The garage wasn't. Warm, welcoming, and filled with people who understood that intelligence was something to be celebrated, not hidden. For the first time in years, I slept in a real bed, in a heated room, surrounded by people who valued the same things I did. My roommate, Lisa Chen, was a computer science prodigy from California who had built her first app at 13. She looked at my renewable energy projects with genuine interest, not the polite dismissal I had grown accustomed to at home. But even in this environment where my abilities were finally appreciated, I carried the garage with me everywhere. Not just the memories of those cold nights, but the fierce independence and self-reliance that 3 years of isolation had burned into my character. While my classmates formed study groups and social circles, I worked alone, driven by an intensity that sometimes worried my professors. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, my advanced programming instructor, pulled me aside after class one afternoon during my sophomore year. "Jessica, your work is exceptional, but you seem to be pushing yourself beyond what's healthy. When was the last time you took a day off?" I couldn't remember. Between my regular coursework, my ongoing freelance projects, and The new venture I was developing in secret, every hour of every day was accounted for. I had discovered blockchain technology in its early stages and was building something that would eventually become the foundation of my first major breakthrough. A decentralized energy trading platform that allowed homeowners with solar panels to sell excess power directly to their neighbors. "I'm fine, Dr. Rodriguez," I assured her, though the circles under my eyes probably told a different story. "I have some projects I'm working on that require extra attention." She studied me with concern. "You remind me of myself at your age. Brilliant, driven, but carrying something heavy that you won't talk about. If you ever need someone to listen." I appreciated the offer, but I had learned long ago that vulnerability was a luxury I couldn't afford. While my classmates called home to complain about difficult assignments or ask for money, I hadn't spoken to my parents since move-in day. They had driven me to campus in their luxury SUV, helped me carry my belongings to the dorm, and left without ceremony. No emotional goodbye, no words of encouragement, just a practical handoff like I was a package being delivered to the correct address. Marcus had come along for the ride, mainly to take pictures of himself at the prestigious university that he would post on social media with captions suggesting he was considering applying. During the brief time we spent together, he regaled me with stories of his latest venture, a social media consulting business that consisted mainly of him convincing local businesses to pay him to manage their Instagram accounts. "College is really just an outdated system anyway," he had told me while posing for selfies in front of the MIT dome. "The real money is in entrepreneurship and personal branding. You're smart, Jess, but you're thinking too small. Nobody gets rich working for other people. If he only knew." By my sophomore year, my freelance work had evolved far beyond simple website design. I was developing custom software solutions for tech startups, creating AI-driven analytics platforms for Fortune 500 companies, and consulting on cybersecurity implementations for government contractors. The revenue from my various projects was approaching 6 figures annually, and I was reinvesting every penny into cryptocurrency, emerging tech stocks, and real estate investment trusts. But the crown jewel of my portfolio was PowerGrid, the energy trading platform I had been developing. Since freshman year, what started as a theoretical solution to inefficiencies in renewable energy distribution had evolved into a working prototype that could revolutionize how electricity was bought and sold in residential markets. The breakthrough came during winter break of my junior year. Instead of going home to Connecticut, a prospect that filled me with dread, I stayed on campus and worked around the clock to complete PowerGrid's beta version. On New Year's Eve, while my classmates were celebrating, I was in the computer lab running final tests on the algorithm that would change my life. The platform worked flawlessly. Home solar panel owners could automatically sell excess energy to their neighbors during peak demand periods, bypassing traditional utility companies and maximizing their return on investment. The system was elegant, efficient, and exactly the kind of disruptive technology that venture capitalists dreamed about finding. I spent the first month of spring semester quietly approaching potential beta testers, homeowners in progressive communities who were early adopters of renewable energy technology. Within weeks, I had a network of 50 households successfully trading energy through my platform, with transaction volumes growing daily. The validation came in March, when TechCrunch published an article about emerging trends in renewable energy. PowerGrid was mentioned as an example of student innovation that could reshape entire industries. Suddenly, my inbox was flooded with inquiries from investors, energy companies, and tech giants who wanted to know more about the mysterious platform that was quietly revolutionizing residential energy markets. I was careful about who I spoke with. Having learned from watching Marcus's various failed ventures, I understood that timing and leverage were everything in business negotiations. I wasn't going to sell out cheap just because someone offered me money. Instead, I used the attention to refine my technology and expand my user base, building value that would translate into serious wealth when the time was right. My first real offer came from GreenTech Ventures, a California-based firm that specialized in renewable energy investments. They wanted to acquire PowerGrid for $12 million, more money than I had ever imagined possessing. But I had done my research on comparable transactions, and I knew my platform was worth significantly more. I countered with $30 million, plus retention of a controlling stake in the company. The negotiations took 3 months, during which I learned more about corporate finance and deal structure than most MBA students absorb in 2 years. When we finally reached an agreement, $25 million upfront plus equity that valued the company at $80 million, I was 20 years old and officially wealthy beyond my parents' comprehension. The strange thing was, I felt no urge to celebrate or even tell anyone about my success. My classmates were stressed about internship applications and student loan payments, while I was quietly managing a portfolio worth more than most people would earn in their entire careers. The isolation I had learned in the garage served me well in this new reality. I understood the value of keeping secrets, of maintaining appearances while pursuing goals that others couldn't see. But I also understood that wealth without purpose was just accumulation. Every dollar I earned, every successful project I completed, every milestone I reached was building towards something larger, the day when I would have enough power to orchestrate perfect justice for the family that had thrown me away. I started researching my parents' business during my senior year. Donovan Construction had been struggling since the housing market crash, surviving mainly on municipal contracts and the reputation my grandfather had built decades earlier. My father was a competent site manager, but a terrible businessman, and the company's financial records, which I accessed through methods I preferred not to examine too closely, revealed a pattern of poor decision-making and overextension that would eventually lead to collapse. Marcus's various ventures were even more precarious. His social media consulting business had exactly 3 clients, none of whom were paying their bills on time. His latest scheme involved importing novelty electronics from China and selling them through an e-commerce site that generated more returns than profits. He was burning through money faster than he could raise it, funding his lifestyle with credit cards and personal loans that he had no realistic plan to repay. The beautiful thing was that I didn't need to actively sabotage them. They were perfectly capable of destroying themselves through their own poor choices and entitled attitudes. All I had to do was ensure that when they finally fell, there would be no safety net to catch them, except for the one I would offer on my own terms. I graduated summa cum laude with a double major in electrical engineering and computer science. My parents attended the ceremony, arriving late and leaving early to beat traffic. They took a few obligatory photos and made small talk about my plans for the future, but I could see they were distracted by concerns about Marcus, who had recently totaled another car and was facing possible jail time for repeated DUI offenses. "We're very proud of you, Jessica," my mother said as we stood outside the auditorium after the ceremony. But her eyes were on her phone, reading text updates about Marcus's court hearing. "You've always been so responsible." Responsible. That was their word for me, the same way fragile had been their word for Marcus. I was responsible for taking care of myself, for not causing problems, for accepting whatever scraps of attention they had left over after managing their son's latest crisis. Standing there in my cap and gown, holding a degree from one of the world's most prestigious universities while my parents checked their phones and worried about my brother's self-created problems, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This was the last time I would accept their dismissal, the last time I would pretend that their indifference didn't matter. The next phase of my plan was already in motion. PowerGrid had been acquired by Tesla for $250 million, making me one of the youngest female entrepreneurs to achieve a 9-figure exit. I was moving to New York to launch my next venture, a comprehensive AI platform that would make my renewable energy success look like a practice round. My parents had no idea that their struggling, overlooked daughter was about to become one of the most powerful people in tech. They would learn eventually, but not until I was ready to teach them. Not until I had built something so undeniably successful that even they couldn't ignore it. The garage had taught me patience. Now it was time to put that lesson to use. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, 3 years after I had graduated from MIT, and 2 years since I had last spoken to my family. I was in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson River, reviewing acquisition proposals for my latest company, Meridian Dynamics, when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. My father's voice was strained, older somehow, carrying a weight that hadn't been there during our brief conversation at graduation. "Jessica, we need to talk." I set down my tablet and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. Below me, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their dreams, building their fortunes, creating their legacies. I had become part of that energy, one of the invisible forces that shaped markets and moved billions of dollars with strategic decisions. "It's been 3 years, Dad. What could we possibly need to talk about?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his labored breathing. "It's Marcus. He's in serious trouble this time." Of course it was Marcus. It was always Marcus. Even now, when their golden child had finally exhausted every second chance and safety net they had provided, they were calling me to clean up the mess. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had been monitoring my family's situation through private investigators for months, watching their carefully constructed world collapse in slow motion. Marcus's latest venture, a cryptocurrency trading platform that was really just a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, had finally attracted the attention of federal prosecutors. "The FBI raided his apartment yesterday," my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They seized his computers, his bank records, everything. His lawyer says they're building a case for wire fraud and money laundering." I felt no satisfaction. At the news, only a cold confirmation that Marcus had finally achieved the inevitable result of his lifelong pattern of taking shortcuts and expecting others to fix his problems. The cryptocurrency scheme had been particularly brazen, even by his standards. He had convinced dozens of investors to give him money for a trading algorithm that didn't exist, using the funds to pay earlier investors while skimming enough to maintain his expensive lifestyle. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it, not because I felt bad for Marcus, but because I was genuinely sorry that he had chosen to become the kind of person who would defraud his own friends and neighbors rather than develop actual skills or work ethic. "Jessica, we need your help." The words seemed to physically pain him. "The legal fees alone are going to cost us everything. We've already mortgaged the house twice, and the lawyers are saying this could take years to resolve." Now we were getting to the real reason for the call. Not concern for their daughter's well-being, not curiosity about my life or career, but money. They needed financial help, and I was the only person they knew who might have access to significant funds. What they didn't know was that I had more money than all 3 of them could spend in several lifetimes. Meridian Dynamics had gone public 8 months earlier in an IPO that valued the company at $12 billion. My personal stake was worth over $4 billion, making me one of the youngest female billionaires in history. The penthouse apartment I was standing in had cost $47 million, purchased with cash the same way some people bought coffee. "How much do you need?" I asked. $2 million, he said quickly, as if he had been rehearsing the number. "Maybe 3, depending on how long the trial takes." I know it's a lot to ask, but Marcus is family. He made some mistakes, but he doesn't deserve to go to prison. Mistakes. That was a fascinating way to describe systematically defrauding dozens of people out of their life savings. But it was typical of how my parents had always framed Marcus's behavior, not as conscious choices with predictable consequences, but as unfortunate accidents that required other people to sacrifice for his benefit. "I'll need to think about it," I said. "This is a significant amount of money." Of course, my father said, relief evident in his voice. Take whatever time you need. We're just grateful that you're willing to consider helping. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the window processing the conversation. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the opportunity I had been building toward for years. My family was finally desperate enough to swallow their pride and ask for help from the daughter they had dismissed and discarded. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. There was more work to be done, more pressure to be applied before the perfect moment for justice arrived. I called my head of security, David Martinez, a former Secret Service agent who managed my personal protection and private investigation needs. David, I need you to accelerate the surveillance on the Donovan family. I want daily reports on their financial situation, legal proceedings, and personal stress levels. And I want to know the moment they reach the point where they're willing to lose everything rather than see Marcus go to prison. Understood, David replied in his characteristically professional tone. Should we continue to monitor their communication with potential lenders? Absolutely. I want to know about every loan application, every phone call to wealthy friends, every attempt to raise money through conventional means. When those options are exhausted, they'll be ready for my offer. The next 3 months were a masterclass in watching privilege collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. My parents burned through their retirement savings, sold my mother's jewelry collection, and even attempted to liquidate my father's classic car restoration hobby. Marcus, meanwhile, remained in denial about the severity of his situation, convinced that his lawyers would find a way to make the charges disappear. I watched it all through carefully placed surveillance equipment and regular reports from David's team. My parents aged visibly under the stress, their comfortable suburban lifestyle giving way to budget grocery shopping and canceled country club memberships. The house they had been so proud of, the one where Marcus had his special bedroom while I slept in the garage, was now at risk of foreclosure as they struggled to keep up with legal fees. The breaking point came on a Friday in January. Marcus's preliminary hearing had gone badly, with the judge denying bail and ordering him to remain in federal custody until trial. The prosecutor had presented evidence that Marcus had been planning to flee the country with stolen investor funds, making him a flight risk despite his family's protests. My father called me that evening, and this time I could hear tears in his voice. They're keeping him in jail, he said without preamble. The judge won't set bail. Marcus is in a federal detention center with actual criminals. I let him talk, listening to his description of visiting his son in an orange jumpsuit, sitting across from him in a sterile room while guards watched their every move. This was probably the first time in Marcus's 28 years that he had faced genuine consequences for his actions, and my father was clearly struggling to process the reality that his golden child wasn't going to be rescued by charm and family connections. The lawyer says we need at least $5 million now, my father continued. Maybe more if this goes to trial. We've lost everything, Jessica. The house, the business, our savings. It's all gone or tied up in legal proceedings. What about your friends? The people you know from the country club? There was a bitter laugh. Turns out wealthy people don't like to associate with families under federal investigation. Amazing how quickly 20 years of friendship can disappear when someone needs actual help. This was the moment I had been waiting for. My parents had finally learned what I had known since I was 15 years old. That their social status was an illusion, their relationships were transactional, and their sense of security was built on foundations that could crumble in an instant. Can help you? I said quietly. Thank you, he whispered. I know things have been complicated between us, but family is family. Family is family. How convenient that they remembered I was family when they needed money from me. But there are conditions, I continued. Anything. Whatever you need. I want to meet with you and Mom in person, not at your house, somewhere neutral where we can discuss this properly. Of course. When and where? I smiled, looking out at the city that had become my kingdom. "I'll send you an address tomorrow. Come alone, and be prepared to discuss more than just money. We have a lot of catching up to do." After hanging up, I called James Wellington, the estate manager I had recently hired for a property I was acquiring in Connecticut. The Berkshire estate was a $47 million mansion that had been on the market for 2 years, waiting for someone with both the money and the vision to restore it to its former glory. "James, I need you to prepare the estate for some very special guests. They'll be staying indefinitely, and I want them to be impressed but not comfortable. Do you understand the distinction?" "Perfectly, Miss Donovan," he replied. James was one of the few people who knew my real identity, hired specifically because of his discretion and his understanding that some situations required more finesse than others. "Excellent. And James, make sure the garage is particularly well appointed. I have a feeling my guests will be spending a lot of time there." The next morning, I sent my parents an address in Connecticut and instructions to arrive at 3 p.m. sharp. They had no idea they were being summoned to what would soon become their new home, or that the mysterious benefactor they were about to meet was the daughter they had banished to a garage 13 years earlier. The wheel was finally ready to come full circle. The years between leaving that garage and acquiring the Berkshire estate were a carefully orchestrated symphony of strategic moves, each one building toward the moment when I would have enough power to rewrite the story of my family on my own terms. What my parents saw as my disappearance from their lives was actually my transformation into someone they couldn't ignore. They just didn't know it yet. After the Tesla acquisition of Power Grid, I moved to Manhattan with a specific plan. Build an empire so vast and influential that when the time came for justice, it would be absolute and undeniable. The $250 million from the sale was just the beginning, seed money for something much larger. My first major decision was to change my professional identity entirely. Jessica Donovan became Jessica Chen, taking my MIT roommate, Lisa's surname with her enthusiastic permission. Lisa had become one of my closest friends and business partners, one of the few people who knew about my family history and understood why anonymity was essential to my long-term strategy. "You're not just hiding from them," Lisa observed during one of our late-night strategy sessions in my first Manhattan apartment. "You're becoming someone they could never imagine you could be." She was right. Jessica Donovan had been the forgotten daughter, the garage exile, the afterthought. Jessica Chen was going to be unstoppable. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was physical, psychological, and social. I hired the best personal trainers, nutritionists, and stylists that money could buy. The scared teenager who had learned to make herself invisible in her own home became a confident woman who commanded attention in every room she entered. I studied public speaking, took acting classes to perfect my ability to project different personas depending on the situation, and learned to navigate high society events with the same strategic precision I applied to business deals. Most importantly, I built a network of allies and resources that stretched across multiple industries. Every person I met, every relationship I cultivated, every favor I granted was evaluated for its potential utility in the larger game I was playing. I wasn't collecting friends. I was assembling the tools I would need to dismantle my family's world and rebuild it according to my specifications. Meridian Dynamics launched 18 months after I arrived in New York. While Power Grid had been focused on energy efficiency, Meridian was designed to revolutionize how businesses used artificial intelligence for predictive analytics and automated decision-making. The technology was years ahead of anything else on the market, capable of analyzing vast datasets to identify patterns and opportunities that human analysts would miss. Our first major client was Goldman Sachs, who signed a $50 million contract to use Meridian's algorithms for high-frequency trading. Within 6 months, we had similar deals with JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Deutsche Bank. The financial sector loved what we offered because our AI could make them money faster and more efficiently than any human trader. But I was thinking bigger than just financial services. Meridian's technology could be applied to supply chain optimization, healthcare diagnostics, urban planning, and even criminal justice reform. Every major corporation and government agency in the world was a potential client, and I intended to capture as many of them as possible. The expansion was aggressive and methodical. I hired the best talent from Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, offering compensation packages that were impossible to refuse. I opened offices in London, Tokyo, Singapore, and São Paulo, establishing Meridian as a truly global operation. I acquired smaller AI companies that had developed promising technologies, integrating their innovations into our platform while absorbing their intellectual property and human resources. Lisa led our research and development division, pushing the boundaries of what artificial intelligence could accomplish. David Martinez transitioned from personal security to corporate intelligence, building a network of informants and analysts that gave us strategic advantages in every negotiation. James Wellington, meanwhile, became my personal chief of staff, managing my increasingly complex schedule and ensuring that my public persona remained perfectly calibrated for maximum influence. The media attention was inevitable and carefully managed. I appeared on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time, always photographed in settings that projected power and intelligence. The interviews were strategic opportunities to shape my public narrative, the brilliant young entrepreneur who had emerged from nowhere to revolutionize multiple industries. No one asked about my family or personal background, partly because I controlled the conversation and partly because my professional achievements were impressive enough to dominate any discussion. What the journalists didn't know was that every public appearance, every award ceremony, every speaking engagement was being recorded and documented, not for my own ego, but because I wanted my parents to see what their forgotten daughter had become. I knew they would eventually discover my success. David's surveillance team confirmed that my mother had started collecting magazine articles about Jessica Chen after someone at her book club mentioned seeing a familiar face on a business publication cover. The irony was exquisite. My parents were struggling to save their worthless son while their daughter was being hailed as one of the most innovative minds of her generation. Marcus was facing federal charges for running a $2 million scam while I was being invited to economic summits with world leaders to discuss the future of global technology. But personal satisfaction wasn't enough. I needed institutional power, the kind of influence that could reshape entire markets and determine the fate of companies, industries, and individuals. That required going public. The Meridian Dynamics IPO was scheduled for March 15th. Exactly. 8 years after I had walked out of my parents' house with nothing but a laptop and a determination to prove them wrong. The timing wasn't coincidental. I had planned every aspect of this moment to maximize its symbolic impact. Leading up to the IPO, I orchestrated a carefully planned media campaign that positioned Meridian as the most important technology company to emerge since Google. We announced partnerships with NASA for space exploration analytics, with the Pentagon for national security applications, and with the World Health Organization for global disease monitoring. Each announcement drove more institutional interest and pushed our projected valuation higher. The roadshow was a masterpiece of strategic theater. I presented Meridian's vision to investors in New York, London, Hong Kong, and Silicon Valley, demonstrating not just our current capabilities, but our potential to transform every aspect of human civilization. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and hedge funds competed to secure allocation in what was being called the most significant technology IPO in history. On the morning of March 15th, I stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that had cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payment. As I rang the opening bell, I thought about the 15-year-old girl who had been banished to a garage for having the audacity to excel at science. She would have never imagined that her exile would lead to this moment, commanding the attention of the global financial system and creating wealth that would influence markets for generations. Meridian opened at $45 per share and closed the day at $78, giving the company a market capitalization of $12 billion. My personal stake was worth $4.2 billion, making me the youngest female billionaire in American history. The celebration that night was attended by tech luminaries, political figures, and media personalities who wanted to be associated with Meridian's success. But I spent most of the evening thinking about my next moves. The IPO wasn't the end of my journey. It was the moment when I finally had enough power to begin the endgame. Over the following months, I used my newfound wealth and influence to begin positioning the pieces for my family's reckoning. I acquired the Berkshire estate through a shell company, began monitoring my parents' financial situation more closely, and started subtle manipulations that would accelerate their decline. Nothing illegal or directly harmful, just the strategic withdrawal of opportunities and the quiet spread of information that would make their situation more precarious. The beauty of having real power was that I didn't need to actively destroy them. I just needed to ensure that when they finally fell, they would have nowhere to turn except to the daughter they had discarded. And when that moment came, I would be ready with an offer they couldn't refuse and conditions they couldn't escape. Standing in my penthouse office, watching my parents' car pull through the gates of my estate, I realized that everything had led to this moment. The cold nights in the garage, the years of being overlooked and dismissed, the loneliness of building an empire in secret. It had all been preparation for the perfect symmetry of justice that was about to unfold. They thought they were meeting a mysterious benefactor who might save their family. Instead, they were about to discover that their salvation and their judgment would come from the same source. The daughter who had learned in that garage that power isn't given, it's taken. The Berkshire Estate's main entrance hall was designed to intimidate. 40-foot ceilings, hand-painted murals depicting scenes from American industrial history, and a crystal chandelier that had been crafted in Vienna in 1889. As I watched my parents enter through the hidden cameras, I could see the immediate effect the space had on them. They walked more slowly, spoke in hushed tones, and kept looking around with the wide-eyed wonder of people who had never been in the presence of true wealth. My father wore his best suit, the one he had purchased for Marcus's college graduation, 7 years earlier. It was well made but clearly off the rack, and it hung on his frame differently than it used to. The stress of the past year had aged him dramatically, adding gray to his hair and lines around his eyes that made him look every one of his 65 years. My mother had attempted to dress for the occasion in what I recognized as her most expensive outfit, a cream-colored dress and matching jacket that she had worn to charity fundraisers back when they could afford to be philanthropic. James greeted them with perfect professional courtesy, taking their coats and guiding them toward the library where I was waiting. I had chosen this room specifically for our reunion because it embodied everything my parents had always claimed to value: tradition, education, and the kind of old money sophistication they had spent their lives trying to emulate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions, leather furniture that had been crafted by master artisans, and windows that looked out over perfectly manicured gardens that required a staff of 12 to maintain. I stood with my back to the door when they entered, looking out at the grounds while holding a crystal glass of 30-year-old scotch that cost more per bottle than they currently spent on groceries in a month. I wanted them to see me in this setting before they recognized me, to understand the level of wealth and power they were dealing with before the shock of my identity complicated their emotions. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, James announced, using the false names I had provided for their stay. Allow me to present Miss Chen. I turned slowly, taking time to study their faces as recognition dawned. My father's expression went through several stages: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally a kind of panicked understanding. My mother simply stared, her mouth slightly open, as if her brain couldn't process what her eyes were showing her. Hello, Mother, Father. I set down my glass and walked toward them, my heels clicking on the marble floor. It's been quite some time, The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could hear the antique grandfather clock in the corner marking time, the distant sound of gardeners working outside, and the almost imperceptible hum of the climate control system that kept the mansion at a perfect 72 degrees year-round. My father found his voice first. "Jessica? But how? This is impossible." "Is it?" I gestured around the room with its priceless artwork and museum-quality furniture. "You called me for help with Marcus's legal fees. I offered to meet with you to discuss the situation. Here, we are." My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're Jessica Chen, the billionaire. The woman who... We read about you in Forbes, Fortune, Time, The Wall Street Journal," I completed for her. "Yes, I've been featured in quite a few publications over the years. It's amazing how much attention the media pays to someone who builds something successful from nothing." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. For 8 years, my parents had been reading about my achievements in business magazines, never making the connection between the tech mogul Jessica Chen and their forgotten daughter Jessica Donovan. They had seen my face on magazine covers, watched interviews with me on financial news programs, and lived in a world where my innovations were reshaping entire industries, all while believing their youngest child had simply disappeared into obscurity. My father's face was cycling through a series of emotions: pride, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years," we thought. "You thought what? That I had failed? That I was struggling somewhere, barely making ends meet?" I walked to the window, looking out at gardens that employed more people than his construction company ever had. "You threw me out of your house for defending myself. You made it clear that I was worth less than Marcus's comfort, less than maintaining the family peace. Why would I share my success with people who had already decided I was expendable?" My mother stepped forward, tears forming in her eyes. "We were wrong. We can see that now. But you're our daughter. Family is supposed to forgive." I turned back to face them, and I'm sure they could see the coldness in my expression. Family. That's an interesting concept coming from you, Mother. Was I family when you packed my belongings and moved me to the garage? Was I family when you prioritized Marcus's non-existent music career over my need for basic dignity? Was I family when you threw me out for having the audacity to stand up for myself? The questions hung in the air, like accusations. I had practiced this moment in my mind for years, but actually speaking these words to their faces felt different than I had expected. There was power in it, certainly, but also a kind of sadness that surprised me. My father tried to regain some authority, straightening his shoulders in a gesture I remembered from childhood. "We made mistakes. We admit that. But we were young parents, doing the best we could with a difficult situation." Difficult situation? I laughed, and the sound echoed off the library's high ceiling. Marcus was never difficult. Marcus was enabled. There's a difference. You created the situation by refusing to set boundaries, refusing to hold him accountable, and deciding that someone else, me, should bear the cost of your parenting failures. I walked to the massive mahogany desk that dominated one corner of the room and picked up a folder that James had prepared for this meeting. Inside were photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports documenting every aspect of my family's decline over the past decade. "Would you like to know what I know about your difficult situation?" I opened the folder and began laying out photographs on the desk. Marcus has been arrested 17 times since I left home. Drunk driving, public intoxication, assault, fraud, and now his masterpiece: bilking investors out of $2 million with a cryptocurrency scheme that a high school economics student could have identified as fraudulent. My parents stared at the photographs. Mugshots, court documents, newspaper articles about Marcus's various legal troubles. I had been collecting this evidence for years, building a comprehensive record of their golden child's spectacular failure to launch. You mortgaged your house twice to pay for his legal fees, I continued, laying out bank statements and loan documents. You depleted your retirement savings, sold your mother's jewelry, liquidated your insurance policies, and borrowed money from friends who now won't return your phone calls, all to protect a son who has never shown the slightest gratitude for your sacrifices or any intention of changing his behavior. My mother was crying openly now, but I felt no sympathy. These were the same tears she had used to manipulate me into compliance when I was younger, the same emotional displays that had always shifted focus away from Marcus's problems and onto everyone else's responsibility to fix them. The business is bankrupt, I said, placing the final stack of documents on the desk. Donovan Construction owes $3 million to creditors and has assets worth maybe $400,000. Your house is in foreclosure. Your credit is destroyed, and your son is facing 20 years in federal prison. My father stared at the evidence of his life's complete collapse spread across the desk. How do you know all this? I know because I made it my business to know. For 8 years I've been watching, waiting, and preparing for this moment. I walked back to the window, giving them time to process the magnitude of their situation. Every bank that rejected your loan applications, every investor who lost interest in your projects, every potential client who decided to go with a competitor, I had a hand in all of it. The admission hung between us like a sword. My parents looked at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief, finally understanding that their financial ruin hadn't been a series of unfortunate coincidences, but a carefully orchestrated campaign. You destroyed us, my father said, his voice hollow. No, I corrected him. I simply removed the artificial supports that were propping up your undeserved success. Your construction company was surviving on reputation and legacy contracts, but the work was poor and the management was incompetent. I just made sure potential clients knew the truth. Marcus's various schemes were disasters waiting to happen. I merely provided him with enough rope to hang himself. I turned back to face them, and I could see that they were finally beginning to understand the scope of what had happened to them. Everything that's happened to you is the natural consequence of your own choices. I just made sure you couldn't escape those consequences through luck or connections. My mother looked up at me with desperate eyes. What do you want from us? Want? I smiled, and it wasn't a warm expression. I don't want anything from you. You called me, remember? You need help with Marcus's legal fees. You need a place to live because your house is being foreclosed. You need money because you've spent everything trying to save a son who will never be worth saving. I walked to the desk and picked up a legal document that James had prepared. I'm prepared to help you. All of it. Marcus's legal fees, a place to live, living expenses, everything you need to maintain some dignity in your final years. Hope flickered in their eyes for the first time since they had recognized me. But there are conditions, I continued. Anything, my father said quickly. Whatever you want. I set the contract on the desk between us. First, you'll live here, in the Berkshire estate. There's a small apartment above the garage that's been prepared for you. It's comfortable, climate-controlled, and fully furnished. They nodded eagerly, not yet understanding the significance of the garage reference. Second, you'll work for your keep. This estate requires constant maintenance, gardening, cleaning, general upkeep. You'll be responsible for ensuring everything remains in perfect condition. Again, they nodded. Manual labor was a small price to pay for financial security. Third, Marcus is never welcome here. Not for visits, not for holidays, not even if he's released from prison. He made his choices and now he lives with the consequences. My mother started to protest, but I held up my hand. Fourth, every evening, at sunset, you'll spend 1 hour in the garage. Not the apartment above it, The actual garage. No matter the weather, no matter how you're feeling, no matter what else you might want to be doing. You'll sit in that space and think about the choices that brought you there. The significance of this condition was finally dawning on them. My father's face went pale as he realized what I was asking. "That's cruel," my mother whispered. "Cruel?" I walked around the desk to stand directly in front of them. "Cruel is making your 15-year-old daughter sleep in a garage while her brother lives in luxury. Cruel is throwing your child out of the house for defending herself. Cruel is ignoring every achievement she makes while celebrating mediocrity from the child who never earned anything." I picked up the contract and held it out to them. "This isn't cruelty. This is justice. You'll experience exactly what you put me through, except you'll be doing it as adults with full understanding of your choices, not as a confused teenager who thought her parents loved her." They stared at the contract as if it were a snake that might bite them. "What if we refuse?" my father asked. I smiled and walked back to the window. "Then you're free to leave. James will drive you back to town, and you can figure out how to pay for Marcus's defense with the nothing you have left. I'm sure the public defender will do an adequate job, and maybe the federal prison system will teach Marcus some life lessons that you never bothered to provide." The choice was simple, and we all knew it. They could accept my terms and live in comfort while experiencing a fraction of the humiliation they had imposed on me, or they could maintain their pride and watch their family completely disintegrate. My father picked up the contract with shaking hands. "Where do we sign?" As I watched them initially each page, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more complete than any business success I had ever achieved. This wasn't about money or power or public recognition. This was about balance, about ensuring that the people who had taught me that love was conditional finally learned what it felt like to be on the wrong side of those conditions. They finished signing and looked up at me expectantly, as if they hoped for some sign of forgiveness or reconciliation now that they had submitted to my demands. Instead, I pressed a button on the desk, and James appeared in the doorway. "James, please show Mr. and Mrs. Donovan to their quarters. I believe they'll find everything they need for a comfortable stay." As they were led away, I remained in the library, finishing my scotch and savoring the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to remind them of their place in this new world order. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, I knew that the daughter they had banished to the garage was finally, completely, undeniably in control. The wheel had come full circle, and justice was served cold, just like those Connecticut winter nights I had endured in their garage, dreaming of this exact moment. 6 months later, I stood in the same library window where I had delivered their ultimatum, watching my parents through the security cameras as they completed their evening ritual. At precisely 6 p.m., as the sun began to set over the Berkshire Estates manicured grounds, Robert and Margaret Donovan walked from their apartment above the garage down to the main garage floor, where 2 simple wooden chairs waited for them. They had aged considerably during their time at the estate. The stress of their new reality, combined with the physical demands of maintaining my property, had taken a visible toll. My father's once proud posture was permanently bent from hours of gardening and groundskeeping. My mother's hands, which had never known manual labor during her privileged suburban years, were now calloused from cleaning and polishing the mansion's countless surfaces. But it was their evening garage sessions that had changed them most profoundly. Every night for 183 consecutive evenings, they had sat in that space and contemplated the choices that had brought them there. No phones, no books, no distractions. Just an hour of mandatory reflection on the consequences of their parenting decisions. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The first few weeks had been filled with resentment and whispered complaints about my cruelty. They had tried to frame their situation as temporary, convincing themselves that they would find a way to escape my conditions and return to their former lives. But as the weeks turned to months, and as the reality of their complete dependence on my mercy became undeniable, something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their past. Tonight was special, though. Tonight was the 6-month anniversary of their arrival, and I had planned something that would complete the circle of justice I had been constructing for nearly a decade. I walked down to the garage, my heels echoing in the corridor that connected the main house to the motor court. My parents didn't see me approaching. They were too focused on their mandatory contemplation, staring at the concrete floor as they processed whatever thoughts occupied their minds during these sessions. The garage was everything their old garage hadn't been, climate-controlled to a perfect 70 degrees, with polished concrete floors, state-of-the-art lighting, and enough space to house a dozen luxury vehicles. The Berkshire Estate's previous owner had been a car enthusiast, and the space reflected his passion for automotive excellence. But tonight it served a different purpose, as a monument to irony and a classroom for overdue lessons in empathy. "Good evening," I said, stepping into their field of vision. They looked up, startled. In 6 months, I had never interrupted their evening sessions. This was their time for reflection, and I had respected that boundary as part of the psychological process I was orchestrating. "Jessica," my father said, starting to rise from his chair. "Please don't get up. I wanted to talk to you both about something, and this seems like the appropriate place for the conversation." I pulled a third chair from the corner where James kept it for maintenance purposes and positioned it facing them. For the first time since they had arrived at the estate, I was sitting in a garage with my parents as an equal participant rather than an observer. "Today marks 6 months since you signed my contract," I began. "I thought it might be valuable to discuss how things have been going." My mother's hands were folded in her lap, and I noticed she was wearing the simple work clothes that had replaced her former wardrobe of designer clothing. "We're grateful for your help," she said quietly. "We know we don't deserve it." That was new. 6 months ago, they had still believed they deserved better treatment, better circumstances, and a more comfortable resolution to their problems. The daily routine of manual labor and evening contemplation had apparently taught them something about the relationship between actions and consequences. "Tell me what you think about during these sessions," I said. My parents exchanged a glance. These evening hours had become intensely private for them, a time when they faced truths they had spent decades avoiding. My father spoke first. "We think about you, about what we did to you, about how wrong we were. Be specific." He took a deep breath, as if the words were physically difficult to speak. "We think about the nights you spent in our garage, how cold it must have been, how alone you must have felt, how unfair it was to treat you like you were less important than Marcus." My mother continued where he left off. "We think about all the times we ignored your achievements, the science fair trophies, the perfect grades, the money you were earning from your computer work. We were so focused on Marcus and his problems that we couldn't see what an extraordinary daughter we had right in front of us." "And?" I prompted. "And we think about the night we threw you out," my father said, his voice breaking slightly. "The look on your face when you realized we weren't going to change our minds, how you just accepted it and walked away. We told ourselves you were being dramatic, that you'd come back when you cooled down, but you never did." "Because you never asked me to," I said simply. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. For 8 years they had convinced themselves that my absence was my choice, my stubbornness, my failure to maintain family relationships. But the reality was that they had never once reached out to apologize, to invite me back, or to express any genuine interest in repairing the damage they had done. "We were proud," my mother admitted. "Too proud to admit we had made a mistake. And then too much time passed, and we didn't know how to fix it." I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces in the garage's bright lighting. These were not the same people who had dismissed my achievements and prioritized their son's comfort over my basic dignity. 6 months of consequences had taught them lessons that decades of privilege had prevented them from learning. "What about Marcus?" I asked. The pain that crossed their faces was immediate and profound. This was the wound that cut deepest, the one that had forced them to confront the most uncomfortable truths about their parenting. Marcus is... My father struggled to find the words. Marcus is exactly who we made him. We never taught him that. Actions have consequences. We never made him work for anything or face disappointment. We created a monster and then spent our lives feeding it. He called last week, my mother added. From prison. He wanted us to hire a better lawyer and said the public defender wasn't trying hard enough. He still doesn't understand that we can't save him this time. What did you tell him? We told him we love him, but we can't help him anymore, my father said. We told him he needs to take responsibility for what he's done and try to become a better person. I felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. It had taken 6 months of enforced reflection, but my parents had finally learned to set boundaries with their golden child. How did he respond to that? He hung up on us, my mother said with a bitter smile. Just like he always did when we didn't give him what he wanted. The difference is that now we can see the pattern. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. The garage's climate control system hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the perfect temperature that made this space comfortable rather than punitive. I had designed this entire experience to be educational rather than cruel, though I suspected my parents had needed time to understand the distinction. There's something I want to show you, I said, standing and walking to a cabinet that James had installed near the garage's entrance. Inside were 3 items that I had been saving for this moment: my old laptop from high school, the first check I had ever earned from freelance work, and a photograph of myself at MIT graduation that Lisa had taken when my parents weren't looking. I placed these items on a small table and invited my parents to examine them. This laptop, I said, pointing to the battered machine that had been my gateway to the digital world, is where I learned everything that made me who I am today. I coded my first programs on this in your garage, using the light from that single bare bulb you never bothered to replace. My mother picked up the laptop, turning it over in her hands as if it were an archaeological artifact from a lost civilization. This check, I continued, was the first money I ever earned with my skills. $300 for a website redesign. I was so excited to show it to you, to prove that my playing with computers had real value. Do you remember what you said? My father's face crumpled with shame. We dismissed it. We told you not to get distracted by side projects. And this photograph, I said, picking up the picture from my graduation, captures the moment I received. Recognition as the top computer science graduate in my class. You were there, but you were talking to other parents about Marcus's latest failed business venture instead of celebrating your daughter's achievement. I let them study these artifacts of my journey, these tangible reminders of the daughter they had overlooked and the potential they had ignored. I want you to understand something, I said, returning to my chair. Everything I've accomplished, every dollar I've earned, every company I've built, it all started in that garage. You thought you were punishing me by banishing me there, but you were actually giving me the greatest gift of my life. The motivation to prove you wrong. We know that now, my mother whispered. We understand what we lost. Do you? I asked. Because I'm not sure you fully comprehend the magnitude of what your choices cost our family. I pulled out my phone and showed them a news article from that morning's Wall Street Journal. The headline read, Meridian Dynamics announces $50 billion acquisition of European AI consortium. This deal, I explained, will make me the wealthiest woman in America. It will create tens of thousands of jobs and establish my company as the dominant force in artificial intelligence for the next generation. The daughter you threw away is now more powerful than anyone in our family could have ever imagined. They stared at the article, trying to process the numbers involved. 50. $1 billion was more money than existed in their entire social circle, more wealth than they could conceptualize. But here's what I really want you to understand, I continued. All of this success, all of this power, all of this influence, it could have been yours to share. If you had supported me instead of dismissing me, if you had celebrated my achievements instead of ignoring them, if you had treated me like a daughter instead of an inconvenience, I would have gladly shared everything with you. The full weight of their loss was finally hitting them. They weren't just living with the consequences of their past cruelty. They were living with the knowledge of what they had forfeited through their choices. Instead, I said, you chose to invest everything in Marcus. Your money, your time, your emotional energy, your hopes and dreams. All of it went to a son who has repaid your faith by becoming a federal criminal. You bet everything on the wrong child, and now you're living with the consequences of that decision. My father was crying openly now, tears streaming down his weathered face. We were wrong about everything. We can see that now. The question, I said, is what happens next. They looked at me with a mixture of hope and terror, unsure whether I was about to extend mercy or deliver a final punishment. I stood and walked to the garage's main door, looking out at the estate that sprawled across 200 acres of Connecticut countryside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and formal gardens that my parents maintained with their own hands. I've been thinking about this moment for 8 years, I said, planning exactly what I would say and do. When I finally had you completely at my mercy, I imagined elaborate revenge scenarios, ways to make you suffer that would match the suffering you caused me. I turned back to face them, and I'm sure they could see something different in my expression. But sitting here tonight, seeing who you've become during these 6 months, I realized that revenge isn't what I actually wanted. What I wanted was understanding. I wanted you to know what it felt like to be powerless, to be dependent on someone else's mercy, to have your dignity stripped away by circumstances beyond your control. And we do know, my mother said. We understand now what we put you through. I nodded. Yes, I believe you do. The question is, what are you going to do with that understanding? I walked back to the cabinet and pulled out one final document, a new contract that James had prepared earlier that day. This, I said, placing it on the table, is an amended agreement. It releases you from most of the restrictions in your original contract. You can live in the main house if you want, travel freely, even contact Marcus if you choose. The only requirement is that you continue to spend 1 hour each week in this garage, remembering what you learned here. They stared at the document in disbelief. You're forgiving us? My father asked. I'm giving you a choice, I corrected. You can sign this new agreement and rebuild some version of a relationship with me, or you can maintain the original contract and continue living as my employees. But either way, Marcus remains banned from this property. That boundary is non-negotiable. My parents looked at each other, communicating silently in the way that couples do after decades of marriage. We want to rebuild, my mother said. We want to try to be the parents we should have been from the beginning. Even though it's too late to undo the damage, especially because it's too late, my father said. We can't give you back your childhood or your teenage years. We can't erase the nights you spent in that cold garage or the hurt we caused you. But maybe we can spend whatever time we have left trying to prove that we learned something from our mistakes. I studied their faces, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. But what I saw was genuine remorse, hard-won wisdom, and a humility that 6 months of consequences had beaten into them. All right, I said, picking up a pen and placing it next to the new contract. Let's see if the Donovan family can finally learn to function the way families are supposed to. As they signed the amended agreement, I felt something I hadn't expected. A sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with resolution. The scared teenager who had been banished to a garage 13 years ago was finally, truly, home. The circle was complete, but instead of ending in destruction, it had ended in the possibility of something better. Justice had been served. Lessons had been learned. And maybe, just maybe, a family could be rebuilt from the ashes of its own failures. The garage had taught me strength, patience, and determination. Now it has taught my parents empathy, humility, and the true cost of their choices. It had been a cold, cruel teacher to me, but a necessary one to them, and in the end, we had all learned exactly what we needed to know. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.